Welcome to part 23 in this series of videos on creating a simple purchase order system using Blazor and C#. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at a problem that I've realized exists to do with security and how I'm going to use a GUID to try and circumvent this problem. Without further ado, I'll explain the problem and then we'll see about fixing it. In the previous video, we introduced authentication and authorizations. And here we can see I'm logged in as Christopher Bell, and I can see all the purchase orders that have been entered so far, including those that have been entered by somebody called John. If I now log out and log in as John, John has restricted access and can only see his own orders. And if we choose to preview one of them, the preview comes up and the root is preview order and then slash and then the unique ID of that particular purchase order, the PO header. If I close that, that was 57. If I look at this one, preview it, that's 59. Now, a curious or possibly malicious user could say, well, I wonder what's on order number 58, for example, and manually enter that into the address bar, press return, and lo and behold, they've got access, or they can see what purchase order with the ID 1058 was. Equally, or possibly more seriously, if they choose to edit one of their own orders and then think, okay, I wonder what's on order number 55, they can actually get to order number 55 and they could actually change it. So that's the problem we're faced with. Now, the way around it that I've thought of is to replace the ID of the purchase order with a unique ID that is effectively random, and GUIDs are effectively random numbers, or no, a random string. They're a particular type and they consist basically of 32, I'll say, random characters split into 5 groups and separated by hyphens. And there are so many permutations and combinations that it would actually take somebody making 1 billion guesses a second to keep on guessing for 85 years before they stood a chance of selecting 2 numbers or 2 GUIDs the same. So that's what I'm planning to do. So I'll close this. I'll go back to the code. I'll close it. And instead of for example, when we're looking at the index page, if we look at the routing here on the toolbar click to edit, delete and preview, we'll see we're using the selected PO header from the row selected. I plan to change that to be a GUID. Now, the first thing we need to do is to go to SQL. We'll be doing quite a lot of jumping about in this process. First of all, between SQL and Visual Basic, and then in Visual Basic, we'll similarly be jumping all over the place. But we'll start in SQL. And the first thing we want to do is I need to change the PO header table to include, I'll just show you the design, to include a GUID. Now, I'm not going to enter it in here. I'm going to use a script because we've already got records in the PO header table and I want to add the GUIDs without deleting and starting again. So I've got a script ready. And this is basically saying alter the table PO header, add a column called PO header GUID, and this is the crucial part, unique identifier. That says it's going to be a GUID. It can't be null, and the default is new ID. And just as a side note here, SQL does have another option there saying new sequential ID. And if we were making this the primary key for the PO header table, we should perhaps be thinking about using new SQL ID or sequential ID rather than just new ID. I believe it improves performance as far as indexing is concerned. Right, let me parse that and execute it. So we've now got the GUID on the PO header table. Now, having done that, we need to go back to Visual Studio and select the PO header class and add the new item in here. So let's pop it in here. Notice that it's system.guid as the type. So that's the first thing we need to do. The next thing is if we look at the index, we'll see that on initialization of the index page, it gets the order list. And the order list is the list of the orders, but we are going to need the GUID from the purchase order header so that we can enter in the, where is it, on the preview here, instead of entering the selected PO header ID, that's where we want the GUID from the PO header. So we're going to jump back into SQL, and I'll close that, I don't need that any longer. And on the stored procedures, on the list, we're going to need the PO header GUID. So let's stored procedures, PO header list, modify. And what we're going to need to do in here, in the header, is select, now where shall I copy it from? It doesn't really matter. I'll copy that, paste in there, change that to GUID. And similarly, we need to group it by that item. So I'll parse that and execute it. So now when we get the list of purchase order headers, we'll include the GUID that we've got in there. Back in C# on the index page, we want the GUID in here. So we're going to have to declare that. So somewhere up at the top here, it doesn't matter where, let's put it under there or under here. So we're going to have another variable called selected PO header GUID. And again, type is GUID. And we won't set a default. I'll come to that a little bit later. But now what we want is in the row select handler. So when the user selects a particular row, we want to get the GUID from the list. So where is the row select handler? So in here, missed it. We want the selected PO header GUID as well. And now we've got that there, we should now be able to change this row. Let's just comment that out. Well, what we can do is just change that to say GUID. So that should sort out the index page. I'll save that. But we also need to change the preview order page. On the preview order page, we've got a couple of things we need to change, a couple of problems. First of all, the root is using PO header ID, and we no longer are using that. We're going to be using the GUID. But furthermore, the parameter here, we're not passing in the PO header ID as a parameter. We're passing in the PO header GUID. So we need to change that. So let's delete that and replace it with PO header GUID. We also need to change the page directive up here. So I'll make a bit of space and effectively replace that with the PO header GUID, but we aren't out of the woods yet because we were populating order header by the PO header underscore get one stored procedure and service, and that used the PO header ID, which we no longer have because we're passing the GUID as the parameter, not the ID. I'm not sure if one can pass the PO header ID as a parameter. I couldn't see an easy way of doing it. So what I've decided to do is to create a new stored procedure that says get one by ID. So back to SQL again, and I'll close that. I don't need that. So we've got PO header get one, and I want to, if I look at I'll script the stored procedure to a new query window, and I want to change it so it's called get one by GUID, and instead of the PO header ID being passed as a parameter, I want a PO header GUID, and down here we're selecting it where the PO header is not the GUID equals the parameter being passed in. Right, so let's parse that and execute it. Right, my problem there is that should have been unique identifier. Right, parse it again and execute it. That's better. So we've now created a new get one by GUID stored procedure. So heading back into SQL again, in the PO header service, we need to add that one that says we've got the insert list get one. Now we want to effectively add another one that passes the GUID in. So I'm going to keep that there for the moment. I might decide to get rid of it at a later date, but I'll leave it there for the moment just in case something else is using it, and pop that in there. So that's effectively a duplicate of that PO header get one by GUID, and you'll see I'm passing in the PO header GUID, and the DB type is GUID, and that should be okay. I'm missing closing bracket. Right, that looks happier now. And of course we now need to change the IPO header service by adding in that additional, I'll put it there. So that additional task, get one by GUID. So that sorted out the header and header service, but in the preview order page, we want to replace that with order header, get one by GUID. And we're passing in the PO header GUID. But we still need to get order lines by PO header by the PO header ID. I'm not changing the PO lines, so we're going to get the order lines by using the PO header ID. And to do that, we're going to need to declare the PO header ID. And there's one last thing we need to do. We're getting the order lines by PO header, and we've declared PO header ID, but we haven't actually set it. And to do that, we need to do this. Right, my code there had both lines in, so let's get rid of that one. So PO header ID is derived from the order header object and the PO header ID, which has already been established, and we can therefore get the order lines by PO header. So let's save all that and run it. I'll log in as John. And we've got the two orders there. And if I look at one of these, preview of that order, we can see we've got the order details there, and the root is this very random set of characters. And if I try entering one of those, if I try entering any other guess than a real one, then it's not going to work. I'll probably get an error. Similarly, I can preview another, but again, completely random set of characters from the GUID, so I really don't stand a chance of selecting any others. Fine, and we'll now look at the purchase order page, which equally presents the same kind of problem. So we'll need to go back to the index page. Let's close that, and I'll close these services as well. We don't need those. And on here, on the toolbar, where is it? The toolbar click handler, we've got add and edit, both of which either go to a PO header ID or a selected PO header ID. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is change the navigation manager for that to go to an empty GUID. You can't have them as 0 effectively, or rather you can. Let's put that in there. So GUID.empty is the equivalent of a PO header being 0. I'm not sure if I still need that there. I'm going to leave that there for the time being. And similarly down here, that navigation isn't going to selected PO header ID. It's going to selected PO header GUID. And I will get rid of that. And I'll also get rid of that there. So that's got the the routing working from the index, but we need to look at the purchase order page itself to handle the fact that we aren't going to be passing in a PO header ID of 0. We're going to be passing in an empty GUID. So let's find the purchase order page. And the first thing is the page directive. So we don't want that any longer. It's going to go to purchase order and then the GUID. And similarly, the parameter being passed in is going to be the GUID rather than the PO header ID. So where's the parameter? So that is no longer happening. So I'll get rid of that and replace it with this. Now we're still going to need the PO header ID, so I'm just declaring that, but the parameter being passed in from the index page is going to be the PO header GUID. The next thing is on the initialization. What we've got here is if PO header ID equals 0, it's a new order, but we haven't got a PO header ID. What we've got is an empty GUID. So let's see if we can change that to that. So it's saying if the PO header GUID is an empty one, it's we're adding an order, else we're editing an order. But we've got to change this because we aren't going to be getting the PO header by PO header ID. We're going to need to get the PO header get one by GUID. So I'm going to replace the whole of that with this. So else we're going to populate the order add edit using the get one by GUID. We're still going to need the PO header ID, and we can actually derive that now from the order add edit because that'll already be populated by this line above, and then we can get the order lines by the PO header ID. So that should all fall into place. So let's just save everything and test it. Right, I'll log in as John. And I can select one of my records and edit it if I wanted to. I suppose I ought to test. Look at the preview of that. That looks right. Let's add one. And we'll keep it simple. But just notice that when we're adding an order, the empty GUID is just a series of zeros. So I save that. And again, I can preview it. It's now got an ID. I can edit it, and it's got all the ID information up here. So that all looks good. So I think that just about concludes it for this video. There is one thing that we didn't change on the index, and that was to delete. We use if we go back to the code, well, I'll stop it. if we go back and look at the index for a delete, we're using the PO header ID, and then it's just using the service to get one by PO header. So it's a good reason for not getting rid of the stored procedure, or indeed the service, and then it goes on to confirm delete, and then it will delete it using the PO header. So that's why we haven't changed anything to do with the PO header delete. So everything should now be working fine. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you've got any comments, please leave them in the comment section. I will put links to the web page where I describe this and where you can find the full code. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully next time we'll be getting on to emailing orders or a link to the orders to the supplier. Thank you.